Hey everyone, today I have some pretty fascinating news for you about a study that was performed by researchers at the Australian National University, or ANU, and it was also recently published in the journal Science. The researchers were studying cyanobacteria, specifically cyanobacteria that had been cultivated in low light conditions. You'll see why this is important in just a second. These cyanobacteria are photosynthetic microbes, and they live mostly in the ocean, but they also live almost everywhere. Now, cyanobacteria and plants are the two major groups of photosynthetic organisms on the planet, and they produce all of the molecular oxygen that we breathe. They do this by consuming carbon dioxide and water, and they use a series of light-powered reactions to break these molecules down and generate sugars. And molecular oxygen is produced as a byproduct. Now, the chlorophyll pigments will respond only to particular wavelengths of light. Specifically, they respond to wavelengths of light that contain just the right amount of energy to excite the pigments into a higher energy state. When they're excited into this higher energy state, they can start passing electrons around, and this is how the process of photosynthesis captures light energy and turns it into chemical energy. Chlorophyll A pigments, for example, will absorb, and they're excited by, red light that has a wavelength between 680 and 700 nanometers. Other chlorophyll pigments, like chlorophyll B, show their highest absorption at around 460 nanometers of light, so they absorb blue light. So what's kind of interesting is plants have these two peaks of red and blue light, these two tiny little clusters of wavelengths that they absorb optimally, and that gives them the most energy to run photosynthesis. The standard line of thought has been that because these particular wavelengths impart a discrete and specific amount of energy to the pigments, they're able to bump them up into their activated state. And the reason other wavelengths don't do this is because they either don't have enough energy or they don't have the right amount of energy to put the pigment into a proper activated state. Now you might notice that there's a gap here between these two peaks of high absorption. This gap, which exists from about 500 to about 600 nanometers, give or take, this gap is where photosynthetic pigments just don't really absorb this light. They don't absorb these wavelengths at all, really. Now what's kind of interesting is that these poorly absorbed wavelengths are green light. And because plants and cyanobacteria reflect this light instead of absorbing it, plants and cyanobacteria appear to be various shades of green. That's why plants are green. So this new study examined the range of cyanobacterial light absorption, and they found something really interesting. If you have far-red light, or light with a wavelength around 750 nanometers, this was thought to be not energetic enough to drive water oxidation, and thus photosynthesis. But to conduct their study, the researchers, they examined cyanobacteria that had been bred and raised under far-red light. So this is kind of this low-intensity, low-energy, close to being infrared light. So they were studying individuals from a population that had been under this particular selective pressure for better reactivity with the far-red light. Those microbes that couldn't handle the low-energy light died, while those of them that could handle it and were able to reproduce did so. The result of successive generations of this was a population of cyanobacteria with enzymes that were sensitive to this low-energy, far-red light wavelengths. The researchers found that other pigments in the cyanobacteria, called chlorophyll F pigments, were actually able to capture this far-red light. These pigments were able to absorb 745 nanometer light and 727 nanometer light, and they were able to extract at least some of the precious little energy that those light wavelengths carried within them. The researchers said in their abstract, and I quote, "Each photosystem has a few even longer wavelength chlorophyll Fs that collect light and pass excitation energy uphill to the photochemically active pigments. These photosystems function beyond the red limit, using far red pigments in only a few key positions." Unquote. By few key positions, they mean positions in the satellite array of pigments. These chlorophyll pigments are arranged in kind of this quasi-satellite arrangement, and these are repeating kind of like scales within the chlorophyll. This is a system that kind of optimizes absorption of incoming light, and it was this evolved structural quality. But I'm kind of getting off topic. Anyway, so in essence, they found that these cyanobacteria are actually able to capture this far-red light, and despite its low energy, the pigments can actually squeeze out a little bit of it, and they pass it along to the more dominant A and B pigments, and it kind of gets cycled into the greater photosynthetic processes. Now, this amount of energy, while small, is enough on its own to drive photosynthesis, and that is critical. Because these cyanobacteria can tolerate low-energy, far-red light, and they can use it to photosynthesize and produce biomass and grow, these cyanobacteria microbes are currently considered to be a potentially groundbreaking biological tool in the terraforming of Mars. Now, I know Mars is kind of out of left field here, but it's actually something that the researchers were thinking about. Elmers Cross is an emeritus professor at ANU, and he said, and I quote, "This might sound like science fiction, but space agencies and private companies around the world are actively trying to turn this aspiration into reality in the not-too-distant future. Photosynthesis could theoretically be harnessed with these types of organisms to create air for humans to breathe on Mars. Low-light adapted organisms, such as the cyanobacteria that we've been studying, can grow under rocks and potentially survive the harsh conditions on the red planet." Unquote. To give some context here, cyanobacteria have also been discovered living in the Antarctic ice, in the Mojave Desert, and on the outside of the International Space Station. So it stands to reason that they're probably hardy enough to potentially tolerate Mars. Now, in a more general sense, with less emphasis on Martian terraforming, this study also improves our understanding of photosynthesis as a whole. Jennifer Morton, PhD and co-author of the study, said, and I quote, "Chlorophyll adapted to absorb visible light is very important in photosynthesis for most plants. But our research identifies the so-called red chlorophylls as critical components in photosynthesis in low-light conditions." Unquote. She also added, quote, "This work redefines the minimum energy needed in the light to drive photosynthesis." Unquote. And that, ladies and gentlemen, suggests that photosynthetic life might just be able to live in places that we previously thought were much too dark. Now, maybe it's just me, but more and more, as studies like this come out, I'm inclined to think that the universe could just be crawling with life.